It is an open secret. Zelensky, Ukraine, and NATO have comprehensively lost the war. Stop the war, you fools, as Colonel Douglas MacGregor, one of our great guests this evening, is fond of saying. Well, of course, they could have stopped the war hundreds of thousands of lives ago when an agreement was in sight, initialed, on the table in Ankara in Turkey, until Boris Johnson, on the instructions of Genocide, Joe Biden flew in to say, we must fight on. He had no intention of fighting on himself, of course. He's never fought anything in his puff. He meant that we would fight on to the last drop of Ukrainian blood. And that last drop is fast approaching. The Ukrainians cannot find enough soldiers, even to man the fortifications they are hurriedly digging. Not only is it now comprehensively, in fact universally accepted, that the so-called counter-offensive, which the NATO powers pushed Ukraine into launching for purely filmic, televisual reasons, has not only failed, but has become a cataclysmic reverse. Not only did the Ukrainians lose tens, scores of thousands of dead men, but they have lost the territory that they thought they were going to be able to defend. Now it is universally accepted, though only systematically leaked in the top people's papers, in the top people's magazines, the FT, the Daily Telegraph, the Economist, and so on. It is accepted, nonetheless, that Russia's advance, when it begins, will go exactly as far as President Putin decides he wants it to go. They are desperately now looking for a way out. Can they negotiate some kind of freeze on the conflict? That's certainly Joe Biden's wish, who said that he wants this war over. Because in an election year, a series of military disasters, with a Russian advance going farther and farther into Western Ukraine, is just about the last thing he needs, on top of the horrific pictures which continue to circulate around America and around the war from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. They want to freeze the conflict, a la North and South Korea. But that would require Russia to agree to freeze the conflict. And why would they do that now that everyone agrees they are winning? I remain of the view, oft expressed on this show, that Russia will seek to liberate not just the city of Odessa, the quintessentially Russian Jewish city of Odessa, but all of the coastline and linking up with Transnistria. And they will insist on a government in Kiev for the rump-stump Western Ukrainian state that is entirely loyal to Moscow and not to Brussels and not to Washington. That will require seismic political change in Kiev. They're already preparing for that. The mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, the famous boxer, and the Zaluzhny, the head of the armed forces, are definitely gathering storm for President Zelensky. It's quite likely that before long, and perhaps before the new year chimes have died away, Zelensky will be on a private plane for Miami or for exile in one of the sumptuous homes he has now miraculously become the owner of. What does that mean? Where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us in Europe cold, hungry, jobless, underemployed, and increasingly forlorn and hopeless about our future. It leaves us with a set of leaders who in 2024 will have to be removed from office because they have committed the cardinal sin of committing national suicide on television. They have committed the cardinal sin of cutting the wrists of their own people and of their own country, their own economy, just to please Genocide Joe Biden. As I said on Wednesday, it's one thing to be a vassal of Rome. Julius Caesar was quite the thing. But to be a vassal of Joe Biden who can't chew gum, walk in a straight line at the same time, who can't tie his shoelaces, who can't put on his shoes, who doesn't know where he is or what he's saying. This week, he told us that October 7th was 65 years ago. So sure of it, he said it 3 times. That instead of 65 days ago, it was 65 years ago. That meant his father could have a walk-on part. He told us that his father had gone back to his kibbutz to look for clothes and artifacts to rescue from the ruins of his house. I'm not making that up. It's easily accessible on the internet for anyone who wants to see it. You really would laugh unless you were already crying. That our leaders, so-called social democrats, so-called Greens, in some cases so-called socialists, have done all this, helped Joe Biden throw that huge boomerang at President Putin, only for it to come back and chop the heads of our own people, of our own governments, is almost too much to bear. But what does it mean for President Putin? Well, looking at the poll we're running tonight, which leader commands more respect around the world, Biden or Putin? Well, I'll let you look at the numbers because I can scarcely believe them. 28,407 people have voted. And in one case, 1% of those responding believed that Biden commanded more respect around the world. And that 1%, I'm sure, were exclusively billeted in Broadmoor, the hospital for the criminally insane in the south of England. On Twitter, only 5% thought Biden commanded more respect. On the YouTube community stream, 3% thought it was Biden. On the YouTube stream of this show itself, 4% thought Biden. These are numbers not to be sneered at. Sure, it's not scientific, but it is massive. It is a poll of almost 30,000 people, and I predict it will be 30,000 people by the end of this show, in which 99, 95, 97, and 96% of the people think that Putin commands more respect around the world. And as a matter of objective truth, who among you can possibly doubt that that is the case? Gayatri and I were in the United Arab Emirates when President Putin arrived last week. The sky was painted red, white, and blue. The cavalcade, the welcome from a historically pro-American Gulf country, had to be seen to be believed. No Russian leader, even at the height of Soviet power, with their alliance with Nasser in Egypt, ever received a welcome like this in the Arab and Muslim world. The same was true when he flew on to Saudi Arabia and then flew to Moscow to receive the president of Iran, President Raisi. The prestige of Russia, the standing of Russia in the world, has to be seen to be compared with Russia lying drunk on the floor under President Yeltsin, having its pocket picked by Western businessmen and Western governments. Now, Russia has won the war in Ukraine. What will happen next? Well, one thing I predict: neither Russia nor China, and certainly not both of them together, are ever going to be pushed around by NATO, by the United States, ever again in any place, anywhere in the world. The world changed, I believe, last Wednesday when President Putin arrived in the Persian Gulf. It will be seen historically as the turning point in world affairs when multipolarity became a real thing, when the end of unipolar power of American NATO hegemony died a death in the deserts of the Gulf. And the first place that will be tested will be in Palestine. the conflict there, now 3/4 of a century old, more than 3/4 of a century old, will have to be brought to a conclusion. And that conclusion is not the one that Netanyahu wants, and not the one that has been secretly enabled by the European and North American powers. What do I mean by that? Well, on paper, all of the Western governments support a Palestinian state, the so-called two-state solution. All of them, including the United States itself. After all, the Oslo agreements were signed on American soil in the garden of the White House. So everybody in the West is committed to this so-called two-state solution, a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, and including all of the territories of the West Bank occupied militarily since 1967, and the Gaza Strip, and a contiguity between the two parts of that Palestinian state. But here's the rub. Not only is Netanyahu making it clear that there will be no Palestinian state, but more, he is the only man who can stop a Palestinian state being formed. Now, there comes a point at which this circle cannot be squared. If all the European governments, all the North American governments are committed to a Palestinian state, but they are also arming, funding, proselytizing for a government of Israel which makes it clear there will never be a Palestinian state, the point at which that contradiction can be masked, can be obfuscated, has now passed. Because Russia and China are about to launch a political and diplomatic initiative which will impose that so-called two-state solution, will impose a Palestinian state, and will force all these hypocrite governments that claim that they support such an outcome to come off the fence and to support it. And it's pregnant with the possible rupture and breach, fundamental and final, of the United Nations itself. After all, the Security Council voted with one vote against to demand a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The United States vetoed it. The General Assembly of the United Nations voted with only 10 states against. Well, I say states, but they included Vanuatu, they included the Marshall Islands, they included Micronesia, they included Paraguay, and they included, of course, Israel and the United States itself. The 10 dwarfs, or 8 dwarfs, and Israel and the United States, and then every other country in the world backing the ceasefire and the rapid movement towards a political solution, so that this ghastly horror that we have been watching for not 65 years, Joe Biden, but it feels like 65 years. For me, it's not that far off 65 years, because I've been watching these things. Sometimes there, while they were happening, I have been watching these things for more than half a century. But there comes a point at which all the legal efforts, political efforts, policing efforts to deny people the right to compare what's happening to the Palestinians in their ghetto in Gaza, in their ghetto in the West Bank, with what happened to Jews in the Holocaust of the Second World War, will not be able to succeed. After all, if you are watching, as anyone with access, admittedly fewer than there were a week ago in Britain, access to the Al Jazeera television network, already knows that in a United Nations school, Abu Ghazali school, a United Nations school. Women, children, and men were summarily executed at point blank range in a United Nations school over the last 36 hours. People can see the 3 little girls on the roof watching their father burning alive. Everyone has seen it. Everyone has seen the 25,000 children in Gaza who have now lost one or both of their parents. 25,000 orphans, 10,000 dead children, 5,000 dead women. Everyone has seen it. We know what fascism looks like. We studied the Holocaust. Some of us campaigned to make it a criminal offense to deny the Holocaust. But we're being asked to deny a new Holocaust in 2023. No thanks. A woman, remember I told you on Wednesday, they were looking for a nice peaches and cream, English, middle class, white woman. They were looking for her because of a placard that she carried. I've now seen the placard. The placard merely compares what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust and what's happening to the Palestinians in Gaza. Well, I've got news for you, Inspector Plod. We all can see that. I'm not a placard carrier myself, but let me metaphorically show it to you now, Inspector Plod. The comparison between what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust and what's happening to the Palestinians right now, this day, this evening, is so brazen, so blatant, so vivid, so streaked in red blood of innocent people that only someone willfully blind or somebody evil would continue to deny it. Now, I believe that Israel is led by evil men. I have no doubt that after Netanyahu, another incarnation or iteration of evilness will come to power. I believe that some of our leaders are idiots and some of them are evil. But I don't believe that our people are either idiots or evil. The British people, the French, the European people, the American people, the Canadian people have all shown over the last 65, now 66 days that when they cut them, we know that they surely bleed just like us. Their blood looks like ours. The cries of their children sound like ours. The grief of their parents feels like ours. This is not a world in which, in far-off countries, of which we know little, all kinds of horrors and crimes can be committed. This is a world in which we see them almost in real time. We can watch them live being butchered, and we will not put up with it anymore. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night. It's the mother of all talk shows.